Welcome to the Action Network special coverage of the race to the White House. We will be detailing the presidential election between Kamala Harris and Donald Trump. And I am joined by Dr. Nick Giffen, a predictive analyst here at the Action Network. He's going to walk you through all the facts and figures that are driving polling, betting markets, and all of the chatter that surrounds this election. And speaking of, coming off of the DNC, we're nearly in dead heat in the betting markets. Harris' best number out in the market at this very moment is plus 102. Donald Trump not far behind at plus 105. A reminder to always shop around before you lock these in. Now, let's look at the polls for a moment because while the betting markets are dynamic, polling data lags a bit, and there's just not that much of it coming off of the DNC. There's going to be more polls between likely voters and registered voters in the coming weeks, and there is a distinction between those two groups. But let's start with registered voters. Harris is leading in the latest polls from the Morning Consult, Kaplan Strategies, Angus Reid Global, and the Bullfinch Group. She leads in those polls by just over 5 points on average. So this is where I'm going to bring you in, Dr. Nick. Are you surprised coming off of the DNC and the kind of support and at least TV ratings and positive energy that the campaign was putting out that she's starting to inch out a little bit in front of Donald Trump?
No, I'm not surprised. Traditionally, there is a little bit of a polling bump during and post convention for both candidates, both the Republican National Convention and the Democratic National Convention. Each respective candidate tends to get a bump. So I'm not surprised that's gone up a little bit. However, our Action Network polling average, which I keep track of, hasn't quite caught up to, that 5% number. And that's because those tend to be a little bit lower quality polls. We're still waiting on some higher quality polling data before we see if there really is a convention bump. So maybe by this time next week, we'll have something that's a little bit more telling. But I have Kamala Harris right now in our Action Network polling average leading by 3.1%. It was closer to around 3.6%, but that was before another big piece of news. Robert F. Kennedy Jr. dropped out as a third-party candidate in the swing states. Now he's still running in the safe states and endorsed Donald Trump. So this did, like I said, help Trump in the neighborhood of around half a percentage point. But right now, we have Kamala Harris at around 3.1%, and I would expect a little bit of a bump as we review this next week.
Now, what's different when it comes to betting on politics as opposed to sports is that there's just fewer firm data points to look to that could even indicate where something is heading. Now, the Washington primary, walk me through why that's important in terms of the overall betting environment and voting environment heading into November.
Yeah, traditionally, the Washington primary has been a pretty good bellwether of where the national environment is. Now, of course, Washington is a pretty heavily Democratic state, but it tends to run about 12 percentage points, give or take, depending on the year, ahead of the national environment. And this recent Washington primary points to around a 3 to 6% Democratic environment because a lot of the Washington races were in between around 14 to 22% in favor of the Democratic candidate in the various races that were run, right? There's Secretary of State, Auditor, Treasurer, bunch of House races, Senate, Governor, Lieutenant Governor, all that. So when you kind of average all that out, you get around a 3 to 6% environment. I think when you demographics adjust it, it's closer to a 3 to 4% Washington primary pointing towards, the national average here or the national environment. So definitely a good bellwether, a good consistent bellwether. And again, another piece of data supporting the polling of around Kamala Harris plus 3%.
Now, there's been a handful of special elections around the country as well. Are they in line with those findings from Washington, or are they telling a different story?
Yeah, absolutely in line as well. Special elections are, again, another way to kind of gauge the national environment. Are these special elections running ahead for Republicans or running ahead for Democrats compared to the partisan lean or the partisan voting index of the specific race that's being run? And in 2024, the median is 5%, plus 5% for Democrats compared to the expectation, the partisan voting index, and the mean is 2%. That's because there's been a few very heavily Republican lean ones that have pulled that average away from the median. So somewhere again in that 2 to 5% neighborhood. So I think all the signs really are pointing towards, a Democratic environment of a +3 on average.
I mentioned at the top that a new batch of polling is right around the corner, and that's when they really get into the weeds when they break down specific issues for voters. Obviously, the Republicans, scrambling a bit with this mid-race switch in terms of the candidate. They felt very comfortable going against Joe Biden. They were hammering on him on things that he just really couldn't combat. Where now Harris is a brand new candidate. They're testing some things out and they're trying to go almost fundamental by fundamental. They tried on the economy side, but there's relatively low unemployment for someone who's in a current administration. So it's not exactly low hanging fruit to bang on her campaign about employment and economic numbers. Inflation is also trending down, and the stock market seems to be stabilizing, if not moving upward. So at least from a TV perspective, they've been laser focused on the border issues in terms of immigration and her previous statements. Do you anticipate that heat to only be turned up in the next 2 months? And if so, do you think that'll just follow what they find in the polls? If it's successful, they'll double down or maybe move away from it if there's a bit of voter fatigue on that particular topic.
Yeah, I think they'll definitely hammer the immigration aspect here. Joe Biden and by extension Kamala Harris weak on immigration, I think is a talking point for them. I do also think even though inflation is trending down, that's still an important topic for Republicans to point out because it was high during the Joe Biden presidency. And even though it's coming down, it's not down at that 2% level that we like to keep it. So, and even if inflation is coming down, inflation still means prices are going up. So we got to separate those two. And if prices are still going up, even at a 2% inflation, people will eventually notice that. So I think that's still an important talking point for the Republicans as well. I think we'll be very successful on those two as we, head into the debate next month between Kamala Harris and Donald Trump.
Now, as we continue to report on news, polling, betting market movements, there's a lot of noise, maybe more so than any other market, even entertainment betting. There's so much noise when it comes to the presidential election. What are a few things that you believe are overblown? Trump could go to a Rust Belt state. All of a sudden, people consider him to be more of a challenger in that state because he's spending more time, resources, advertising dollars, boots on the ground, etc. Do you think something like that is overblown? And if not, is there something in particular that you like to avoid that maybe the rest of the media flocks towards?
Yeah, not a whole lot. I mean, I do think, where the candidates go could matter a little bit. We remember back in 2016, Hillary Clinton kind of felt safe in the Rust Belt there and ended up losing the Rust Belt states there. So, which cost her the election. So I do think there's some importance to where the candidates go, where they focus. Vice president picks, I think, can be a little bit overblown, although Donald Trump himself kind of said that it doesn't matter too much. So yeah, the whole intangibles thing right now, I think is a little bit overblown. I'm not putting a whole lot of stock into that. I really just want to see some more quality polling post Democratic National Convention because if we look at the ratings, the DNC had a bump from 2020's DNC in terms of TV ratings, and it had an edge over the RNC this year. So there does seem to be a little bit of an enthusiasm factor that might be factoring in towards the Democrats. And we saw that when we talked about the Washington primary, younger voters turned out at a higher rate than they had in previous Washington primaries, and older voters turned out a little bit lower rates. So again, another indicator that could favor Democrats in terms of enthusiasm.
Next month, we have our debate between Harris and Trump. Do you anticipate that being a swing in the betting markets in polling, or do you think it's more likely that this is just going to maybe move the needle a tick, but not be the tsunami of support in one direction or another?
Yeah, I think the interesting thing with debates is most of the people are locked in on who they're going to vote for. It's really targeting a small fraction of undecided voters, third-party voters, especially with RFK Jr. dropping out. And we could see a swing in the polls after a debate, but that tends to kind of be more of like response bias than an actual movement in the polls. So if your candidate didn't debate well, maybe you don't respond. And if your candidate did debate well, you do respond. And that tends to revert back to where things were pre-debate. So I do think, debates can move the needle, but it has to be kind of a clear win or something that, is really bad on one candidate's part. We've seen it in the past in certain debates back in the 80s and 90s, for example. But I really don't anticipate the debates to move the national environment much, aside from a very small share of independents and undecideds.
Dr. Nick and I will be back next week ahead of that debate, breaking in all of the latest polling data, market movements, as well as financial information, because as that trickles in, that has a big impact for where those campaign dollars are spent, which market and which states they end up spending more of their time. Nick, thank you so much for joining me. And if you are in the audience and you have questions for Dr. Nick, please hit us up on YouTube, on social media, on Twitter, and we'd be happy to answer those questions moving forward as we cover the 2024 presidential election. Thanks so much.